Right, there's another meeting going on at the moment which asks how can we stop the rise of the far right in Europe. Very important meeting. I see this as a complementary meeting. I'm going to ask not how we stop the rise of the far right, but how it is that racist ideas gain a foothold in the first place. And specifically, I want to ask whether music is... Sorry, very squeaky floorboards right there. I want to ask whether music is sometimes complicit in that process. You see, we speak a lot at Marxism about the role that music can play in combating racism. We rightly celebrate the achievements of Rock Against Racism, the campaign which was at its height almost exactly 40 years ago. We rightly talk about the importance of Love Music, Hate Racism now. But what I want to focus our minds on during this session is what happens when left-wingers don't consciously intervene in popular culture, when popular culture is, if you will, left to the captains of the corporate culture industries. What I want to argue is that I think that all too often what Karl Marx predicted can be seen to be true. Karl Marx predicted that the ruling ideas of any period are those of the ruling class. And I want to argue that that is indeed often the case, and that there are sometimes examples that we can find of music being presented in such a way that conforms with and arguably helps to perpetuate a white supremacist and neo-colonial world view. It does this in a couple of different ways. It exaggerates the difference between the audience and the artist. It exaggerates difference. It others the artist and indeed the community that the artist is assumed to represent, and it also distracts us from the reality of what's going on. Music as a weapon of mass distraction, distracting us from the task at hand. So, in order to explain and explore what I mean by all this, I'm going to look at two artifacts, two examples of musicians warning us that this is the role that popular culture all too often plays. The first one I actually nearly named the meeting after. It's a Screaming Jay Hawkins album, and it's called Black Music for White People. Now obviously this is a tongue-in-cheek satire, but I think that Screaming Jay Hawkins was trying to get at, trying to alert people to something that he believed is real. I mean, this album cover says in a single image precisely what I'm going to argue for the next 10 minutes or so. So I nearly called the meeting Black Music for White People, but actually I don't think that it's helpful to imply that it's useful to lump all white people in together. I don't think that's a useful thing to imply. It's a popular thing to do at the moment. It's a good way to sell books and so on. But actually, I don't think it's the best way to try to understand how the world works, or indeed to come up with a strategy for changing the world. And actually, even the phrase black music, I think, is worth discussing. I find it interesting that a lot of progressive people have moved away from the term world music. I mean, I agree with them moving away from it. I agree that it's so broad that it sort of ceases to have any meaning beyond music other than the mainstream in countries like Britain. It's kind of, it both others the music, and it's so broad that it lacks any real meaning. I mean, I think it's worth discussing whether we have to say the same about the phrase black music, whether it's so broad it ceases to have any real meaning. You know, that's something we might want to discuss. So I didn't go with Black Music for White People. I instead went with the title Black Voices, White Visions. And I get that title from the subtitle of a brilliant book by a writer called Mary Beth Hamilton. The book is called In Search of the Blues, and it's fascinating because it looks at the history of blues music, not from the perspective of musicians, but from the perspective of the first people who went out to try to record those musicians. Now, let me set the scene. We are going back to the first couple of decades of the last century. This was the beginning of the record industry. This was a brand new age of mechanical reproduction. And people all over the world were worried about the impact that these new records would have on folk music. That was true all around the world. Now, those who believed that the songs of African Americans in the South, the spirituals, the work songs, the kind of music that would eventually morph into and become called the blues, they fell into two very different camps. The smaller camp included influential black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois was worried that these new pop hits coming out of New York City and being circulated widely and quite quickly across the whole of the USA, that they would distract people from the reality, the harsh reality of life for most African Americans. And on that basis, the songs in the South should be recorded. Mary Beth Hamilton notes that in The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois stressed the spiritual's importance as testimony, a powerful refutation of historians' claims that life was joyous to the black slave, careless and happy. However guarded their language, the sorrow songs confronted the listener with a death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world. The other camp, the other people who thought that the African American songs of the South should be recorded, and indeed the vast majority of the people who actually went out with their, at the time, state-of-the-art recording equipment to find these songs, they were white Southerners who shared ideas of white supremacy. They were disturbed by this confident new urban voice coming out of areas like Harlem, urban black voice. They were disturbed by that, and they wanted to document what they imagined remembering from their childhood, a more primitive sound. And they wanted to do that out of a nostalgic longing, essentially, for what W.E.B. Du Bois describes as the fairy tale of a happy slave civilization. And so Mary Beth Hamilton is arguing that at the core, and I quote, at the core of the idea of the Delta blues, of an undiluted and primal black music, is an emotional attachment to racial difference. Now, if, like me, you're a blues fan, don't worry. There are other chapters in the story of the blues, and I'll touch upon them. But it's important to recognise that that was the motive of a majority of the people championing the music at the beginning. Now, unsurprisingly, they found it hard to find this primitive voice that they imagined remembering from their childhood. What they found when they went into the black communities, when they went into the juke joints and so on, they found that singers and audiences were both playing and enjoying precisely the new sounds that were coming out of New York on the freshly minted 78s. She notes, Mary Beth Hamilton notes, that the awkward fact is, and this was even a couple of decades later, after some of the key Delta blues singers had been recorded, she notes, the awkward fact is that Charlie Patton's recordings sold only moderately in the 1920s and 30s. Those of Son House, Skip James and Robert Johnson sold barely at all. Even in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, the so-called Delta bluesmen had limited appeal. A Fisk University sociologist surveyed the black bars of Clarksdale late in the Depression and found not a single local performer upon the jukeboxes. Top sellers were the same as they were in black areas across the United States. Louis Jordan, Lil Green, Count Basie, Fats Waller, all patently urban, backed by jazz-inflected sounds that pulsed with the rhythms of city life. And so these song collectors faced a bit of a dilemma. Where on earth can we find this authentic, primitive sound, unpolluted by modernity? One of them, John Lomax, decided that the best place to look was in prisons. Because at least in prisons, the men were literally shut away from the modern world. And so he took his recording machine, he loaded it into the back of his car, and he embarked upon a tour of penitentiaries across the South. Now, in one of the most notorious penitentiaries, a place called Angola, he met a man who would become an absolutely towering figure in the mythology of African American music. In fact, if you go to the Blues Kitchen in Brixton later today, you'll see a portrait of this man on the wall. Huddy William Leadbetter, better known as Leadbelly. Now, John Lomax not only liked his voice, but the key thing about Leadbelly was that Leadbelly understood what John Lomax was trying to do, what he was after. And John Lomax thought that he could be useful, that Leadbelly could be useful to him, and therefore he negotiated Leadbelly's release from prison, and he took him on the tour of other penitentiaries. Leadbelly's job was to to translate, really, John Lomax's desires to the inmates. He would say to the inmates, look, this bloke wants your most uncouth, your most unvarnished, your most ungodly songs. That's what he's after. So if you can come up with something like that, then he'll be happy, and so too will the prison guards. He also took Leadbelly on a tour of northern cities. He paraded Leadbelly in front of journalists in New York City. Leadbelly was by now a freed man, but John Lomax insisted that he should wear the convict stripes, and he insisted that journalists should address any questions to John Lomax, not to Leadbelly, for fear that Leadbelly might in some way be corrupted by these questions. So I think it's important to realise that what we have in the first chapter of blues music is white supremacists parading African American artists around as a kind of almost like a circus freak show. Now, as I say, blues lovers, fear not. I mean, there are several more chapters to the story, not least what happened next. Understandably, Leadbelly got fed up with this treatment pretty quickly, and he parted company with John Lomax. But he agreed to keep working with John Lomax's son, Alan Lomax, who had completely different politics to Dad. He was a left-winger, Alan Lomax. When he heard the music of Leadbelly, he didn't hear something primitive. He heard the voice of resistance to racism. And he championed Leadbelly on that basis and introduced him to Woody Guthrie and so on. So, as I say, the story of the blues rolls on, but I think it's very important to recognise this white supremacist template, this template that existed in the beginning, because I believe you see at least echoes of it throughout the 20th century and indeed today. Another example I would give is the story of hip-hop. Many of you will know that hip-hop began in part as a rejection of violence, an attempt to increase the peace, to come up with creative solutions to the challenges faced by poor African American communities in areas like Brooklyn and the South Bronx. It was only when well-heeled white music producers like Rick Rubin got involved that a new subgenre emerged, gangster rap, which of course emphasised the same sorts of things as I think were emphasised on the, in a way, on the Screaming Jay Hawkins album cover. Criminality and, well, in the case of gangster rap, materialism as well. I think you also see it in the promotion of so-called world music now, particularly the way that some African artists are either treated or presented. I write about this a bit in the book, but I won't have time to go into that. Suffice to say that several African musicians based in London have complained to me that if you haven't come from a war zone, if you weren't a child soldier, then white liberal bookers and journalists aren't interested. You do not conform to their notion of what an African artist should be, the story that they should have. Not so very different, if you think about it, from what Screaming Jay Hawkins was getting at. Okay, let's look at the other artifact, the other example of an artist warning us that this is what popular culture all too often does. It is, of course, Childish Gambino's This Is America. I'm sure most of you will have already seen the video. It's the most watched video of the year. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of views on YouTube. It's been a huge cultural phenomenon. I'm going to play it for you. If you haven't seen it, I should warn you that there are two theatrical depictions of gun crime which are quite shocking. So if you're not comfortable viewing that, then please feel free to look away or to leave the room. But what we have is Childish Gambino, who's the actor Donald Glover. We have him deliberately referencing a lot of these sort of racial stereotypes about the black entertainer, about the black performer. He hasn't commented on this, but there's speculation, and I think there's good evidence to support the fact that some of the dance moves, for example, are deliberately referencing the racist character Jim Crow. It's a very, very clever music video, in my opinion. He uses shock to prevent us from relaxing and being entertained. Instead, he constantly challenges us to think about what's going on behind the dancing, smiling faces. Challenges us to think about what's happening in society. Challenges us to think about an America in absolute chaos. So let's have a quick look at Childish Gambino's This Is America. Childish Gambino, This Is America. Powerful stuff, right? So, what can we do about this tendency for culture to other people, often in a racist way, in a way that is ultimately detrimental to all of us, but most particularly to the people being other than the communities that they are assumed to represent? What can we do about the tendency for popular culture to distract us from the things that matter? Well, I mean, we can see what Childish Gambino is doing. I mean, he's a director, an actor, a musician. He is an increasingly powerful man who is taking control of the narrative, and I think that's very exciting. And let's be clear, there have always been progressive black visions articulated by black voices. All power to them. This has been true from Paul Robeson right through to Stormzy and Janelle Monáe. So I think we should do whatever we can to support and encourage that. Ultimately, we need a complete democratisation of the music industry so that it's no longer the case that many of the key gatekeepers are rich white men. That's something else we need to do. I mean, that will probably, let's be clear, that process will probably only be complete when the whole of society is transformed and we no longer have a ruling class. But I think that we can take some steps in the right direction. I think one thing is to be aware of this stuff, and that's what I've hoped to help with in this meeting, to make us more aware of the way that culture can operate, because the more aware of it we are, the more likely we are to spot these things going on, to call them out and to challenge them. I think that whenever we see a new piece of music or experience any new piece of art, we should apply what I'm going to call the Finkelstein test. Sidney Finkelstein was an American Marxist who wrote this in 1948. He wrote this about music. He said, we shouldn't worry about whether it's high art or low art or what genre it is. We should instead ask, is it good or bad? Is it honest or dishonest? Does it give us pleasure to know it? And here's the important one. Does it help us to know better our fellow human beings and the world we share with them? I think if the answer is yes, then it's good art. But if the answer is no, if we're experiencing popular culture or art which lies about our fellow human beings, then we have to call it out as bad art. One thing that we shouldn't do, and I say this as a bit of an aside, but I saw this Facebook discussion going on recently. One thing that I think we shouldn't do is to sort of accept this idea of cultural separation, but just reverse the value judgment. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, you know, I saw I think a well-intentioned person, you know, the people who perhaps rather uncritically celebrate all black music, but then accuse the white artists of being the primitive ones, the rednecks and so on. And I was reminded of this because I saw somebody on Facebook dismiss the music of Bruce Springsteen as white people's music. And I think it was just I think it was a bit of a you know, I think it was tongue-in-cheek. But I couldn't help but say, well, tell that to Clarence Clemens, the black saxophonist who was absolutely integral to the sound of the E Street Band. Tell that to Prince, who listed as his two biggest influences when he was MDing a band at least, James Brown and Bruce Springsteen. Now, we shouldn't be surprised about these things. The truth is that musicians have always been among the least likely to accept ideas about racial separatism, because the truth is that artists of different ethnicities have always made good music and inspired one another, that they wanted to work together. There was a wonderful list of instructions for young musicians, for aspiring musicians, drawn up by the great jazz pianist Thelonious Monk. You can find it online. The last one of this long list of instructions to aspiring musicians simply said this: they tried to get me to hate white people, but someone would always come along and spoil it. Which, of course, I find very heartwarming. Now, before I run out of time, let me say a few words about the identity bit in the subtitle of the meeting. More specifically about what's broadly known as identity politics. People who place a political emphasis on an aspect of their identity, like sexuality or gender or ethnicity. And what I think is that we need to relate to those sorts of ideas in a positive, comradely, sensitive and nuanced way. And there's actually a long tradition of doing so in our political tradition. I remember the founder of the Socialist Workers Party, Tony Cliff, this would have been, I don't know, at least 25 years ago. I remember him saying that the revolution will be led by a black lesbian. And he didn't have a crystal ball, he was making a point, wasn't he? And his point was, if you want to be a tribune of the oppressed, then you need to be led by people who understand oppression in its various layered forms. Now, one or two of you might be thinking, is the irony lost on Dave? Here he is, a white man, talking about this stuff. So let me briefly say this, that if I was the only person at this conference talking about racism and identity, then yes, I think there would be a problem. But since I'm not, I think that criticism misses the bigger point. And we can pick this up in the discussion if you like, but for me, the bigger point is that we should all be talking more about oppression and how to combat it. And yes, of course, people of different genders and ethnicities should be heard in every discussion, not just those about women's oppression and racism, but also those about economics and trade unionism and all the rest. That, for me, is the bigger point. Of course, if there's a panel of speakers and they're all white men, then there's a problem. But here's the thing, if there's a panel of speakers and they look diverse, but actually they've all received a posh education, if they're all Oxbridge graduates, then there's also a problem, I believe. I'm preaching to the choir here at Marxism to bring class into the conversation, aren't I? But it's amazing to me how many people leave class off the list of privileges that need to be checked when we're deciding whether it's time to shut up, take up less space and listen. I think that we should unapologetically bring that to the discussion. Now, of course, for us, class is more than just a part of the discussion. It is, or at least the economic exploitation that it comes from, is the root cause of all of the related problems, or at least the way that they're experienced in the modern world, and also the key link in the chain in terms of transforming the world. But just because that's the case, it doesn't mean that class trumps in some sort of crude way the other parts of a person's identity. Let me explain what I mean with an example. If you're a working class white man and you go onto Facebook or something to attack Kanye West for supporting Trump, but you haven't attacked anyone else for supporting Trump, you haven't attacked Theresa May or anyone else, then I think there's a problem. And actually, even if you've attacked Theresa May, you should still hesitate before attacking Kanye West. I mean, I'm not saying he shouldn't be criticised, he should, but maybe leave it to someone else to do that. Let's be smart, let's be sensible. I'll sum up right now. Thank you. Okay, so this is what I think we should do. We should, yes, intervene whenever possible. Consciously intervene in popular culture whenever possible. Yes, we should roll out Love Music, Hate Racism, and not just to Shoreditch and Brixton, but to the actual places where the far right are recruiting. Where we can't intervene, let's think carefully and critically about the culture that's being consumed. Let's apply that Finkelstein test and call out bad art that doesn't pass it. Let's support and promote progressive black visions. Let's use This Is America as the basis for a conversation with a new audience about the ideological nature of culture and the economic injustice that it helps to perpetuate. And let's be smart about how we relate to others in the campaigns and in the movement and in our lives in general. Thanks for listening.
First of all, thanks. That was a very stimulating introduction. I'll be brief. I have one question, because I heard you several times mention the role of music as distracting us from the real issues that we should deal with. And I'd like to know more precisely what you mean by that, because there are so many examples, right, of music which seems on the surface just completely about having fun and dancing, but which does play a more contradictory role. I mean, I'm thinking about, Little Richard, we're going to have some fun tonight, or Tutti Frutti or Rudy. It's not exactly, dealing with the political issues, lyrically anyway, but at the same time, it's such a symbol, subverting racial identity, sexual identity, and there was the talk about disco yesterday. And again, at the time, many left-wing activists were saying, well, that's, a certain kind of left-wing activists said, well, that was just commercial music that's just distracting people and they're just escaping into this other world. And yet it does play this subversive role as well of, bridging racial barriers, sexual barriers. So I want to know more about what you mean by distracting us.
Yeah, I heard you speaking, I heard you mention gangster rap in a moment, but you didn't go further in that genre, and I would like to know, artists like Tupac or Ice Cube, or even groups like NWA, were criticized for, the violence and the misogyny that their music contained, and they usually say that it was, like a cultural critique or something like of that kind. So, do you think it apported anything to the, black movement?
Say that again.
Sorry?
Just that last bit. Do I think it
apported anything? It was good for the black movement or things like that.
Yeah, it follows on a bit from what the last speaker was saying, because at this moment in time, there is something going on, and what you didn't mention in your talk was actually the state and its interaction with black music as well. So you have a look at what's going on in drill music at the moment, where the police are actively involved in actually censoring the music. I actually don't know drill music, so I can't actually comment on its cultural significance or anything like that. But it strikes me as this being absolutely unacceptable, and that's something that we as a socialists actually stand on the side of the drill artists and say, no, this is not on, and we should fight for their right to actually be heard in whatever. Now, actually, I don't know whether that then gets incorporated into what you're saying here, whether drill music will become you need to be a gangster type person to be famous and so on and so forth. But at this moment in time, what is actually happening is completely and utterly unacceptable, and we should be actually doing something about it.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed that you brought in the Childish Gambino video, This Is America, and it's only a few months, I think, that it's been since it was released, and the first time it was broadcast was on an episode of Saturday Night Live in the United States, when Donald Glover was both the guest hosting the show and the musical guest, but as Childish Gambino. So he performed This Is America on Saturday Night Live, and they dropped the video the same night. And it was amazing, first of all, to watch the video the next day, because I was like, this music is awesome, and I went online to watch the video, and I kept watching it, and then, I mean, it's so layered, you should like see the lyrics and just read what every single word means. But what was so interesting was the reaction online to that video. So as Dave was saying, it was like, it went viral. It was like, you refresh, and it would be like another 40,000 people watch, and then 100,000 people. It was just like totally going viral. But it also spawned these, I don't know if you've seen this on YouTube, but these reaction videos where other musicians and artists or commentators will broadcast themselves watching the video for the first time while the video is playing in a smaller box at the bottom. So it's this really cool thing where you get to see the reaction of so many other political artists and musicians trying to draw out what does this video mean? What is the conversation saying? What I think is so useful about this is that there are many audiences that Childish Gambino is talking to. So there's a conversation underway, I think, within the black community among artists and musicians about what kind of art are we producing? And is it political? Is it distracting? Is it commercial? And I mean, just the whole imagery of the reference to the minstrel shows kind of playing up to a particular audience while there's like chaos, there's police violence, there's urban decay, there is economic decay, there's the erasure of the car manufacturing, all those abandoned American cars at the end speaking to the lost opportunities and the collapse of manufacturing sector in the United States. There's all this conversation happening about what do people see versus what's happening in the background. And I think there's an interesting conversation about how do white audiences consume quote-unquote black art or music, and do we just see the music and the dancing and the whatever, or are we, and is that masking what the experience is of the Black lives in America? Think about Black Lives Matter and the kinds of conversations that those movements are bringing to the forefront. You can see the reverence with which they handle the guns in the video, where the guns are handled with precious cargoes and is taken with the blanket. After there's this massacre, there's references to the violence in gun violence in the United States. But the most exciting thing is what provokes, what kind of conversations does this provoke? Does the shock value? How does this motivate people to be part of those collective struggles, to support artists and musicians who are trying to raise this, to say we want. That there is such engagement within a wider audience is what I think is so radical about this. It's not about an inward conversation. It's saying we need broad solidarity, we need to work together, we need to see all these things together and recognize what the problems are. And it's in the course of that you can see the potential for a multiracial, class-based, working class movement that can challenge the kinds of things that Childish Gambino and other artists are trying to get at.
We heard about drill music, and I want to say something about that because I have represented as a lawyer some young people who've had court cases where they've been involved in making some of these drill music videos. For people who don't know, the reason why the police are saying they have to be banned is because it's argued that this is the music that promotes gun and knife crime and some of the violence that we've been seeing on our streets. And I think it's contradictory because I've seen some of these videos, and on one level they are incredibly creative and well made. They're a measure of the talent that some of these young people have. But on the other hand, some of the messages really are vile. The idea of promoting postcode wars and we're going to come to your area and do this to you is a horrible sign of young people's alienation and bitterness and violence towards each other, which we don't want to see, we don't want to promote. So the question is, what do we do about it? Surely the fundamental question is, we have to involve people in the struggles that are positive and unite people, and struggle for and fight for a society which is very, very different. And recognising that music and culture and so on can be part of that struggle, can provide the soundtrack for that struggle. One of the things that is really inspiring to me, Childish Gambino, and Dave talked about Janelle Monáe and so on, the album at the moment I cannot stop listening to is Kamasi Washington's new album, Heaven and Earth, and his previous album, The Epic, was another example. Brilliant, progressive, dynamic music, which I think helps to drive our movement forward. Of course, he's been around a while, but he made his name playing with Kendrick Lamar, and Kendrick Lamar's brilliant album, To Pimp a Butterfly. And I remember when Black Lives Matter protests in solidarity with America started erupting in this country, the soundtrack to those demonstrations was We're Gonna Be Alright, the Kendrick Lamar song from that album. That is part of the role that music can play. And that's one of the reasons others can talk about it, why Love Music, Hate Racism can be an important part and can play an important political, it's not just a cultural thing, but can play an important political role in moving and motivating and encouraging young people and other people who love music, to be part of the struggles that we necessarily have to be fighting against Trump, Tommy Robinson, the racists who seek to divide us. Music can play a very important part in motivating and moving people and being part of that soundtrack to that movement.
4-line speech, just remind people you don't have to make lengthy contributions. If you've got a question.
I'll take that person, and if I don't take it, just come and pull me off. I think it's great to set the meeting up as you did, because I've been doing some kind of admin type stuff for Love Music, Hate Racism for the last year. 40 years as a journalist makes it cynical, but I've been in and out of some record company offices, and honest to God, they are monocolour. You know, I'm absolutely surprised by how white they are, also how home counties they are, double-barreled names. You know, this is not London. You know, it doesn't look like London, it doesn't look like Britain, it looks like Windsor. A real surprise. So, at the same time, some of those record companies are going to start doing some important stuff for Love Music, Hate Racism and getting the message across. The message will only root if we've got local groups and local activities. So it's going to be a two-tier thing. Ra was much, you know, at the back there, Rock Against Racism, came from the grassroots and produced a cultural fusion. You've got black and white bands on. In 2 years, you've got two-tone, which you know, I think it changed Britain. You know, I really do think it fundamentally changed Britain, and that was a symbol, a musical symbol of a multicultural Britain, rather than two communities that, if you're lucky, were rubbing along together and not interacting very much. So it's an appeal for everybody to go back and encourage local LMHR groups. Judging by the age of most people in the audience, the best way to do that is to get some funding for your local LMHR group through the trade unions, so they've got budget to put the gigs on, so the artists get paid. And actually, this was a lot of how Ra started back in the day, when it moved out of the pubs in East London, out across the country. It was trade unions who were funding it. Just one other plug for Notting Hill Carnival. The National Education Union put a substantial amount of money into making sure that LMHR has a float at the Notting Hill Carnival this year. So the float is going to be commemorating the origins of Carnival, putting some politics back into the origins of Carnival, talking about the Windrush generation, talking about Grenfell again, sharpening the whole event up. It is a massive party, so it should be, but there's more to it. So take some of these flyers, go and do something with it.
It's interesting that the last contributor mentioned two-tone. There's an interesting programme that was on Friday night about sort of history of sort of political music in the 80s and things like that. And actually what happened during the weeks of the Brixton and Socialist riots in '81 was that the Specials' Ghost Town was #1 during that time. And you see the thing that the other comrade said about like the car industry in Coventry, where the Specials were from. And you see that thing, and the things like films like Jubilee and things like that, and the things that were going on in the late 70s, early 80s with punk rock and things like that, to do with sort of industrial decay and things like that. And you're kind of revisiting that time and time and again. And then like 25 years ago when you saw things like Twin Peaks come on and things like that. They're again dealing with that sort of small town, post-industrial, industrial thing like that, and sort of question marks and coming out of that. And also about that same time in the early 90s, I remember, does anybody remember the Disposable Heroes of Hypocrisy?
Yes.
Yeah. Television, the drug of the nation. Yeah, the same thing what people are saying about grime and drill and things like that. It's the same thing. And the guy says in one line, he says, television, is it the reflector or the director? You know, and you say, the violence is all around. You know, I mean, you go somewhere like Japan, where they have, you know, millions and millions of tons of manga comics about the Yakuza and really mad, violent stuff. But there are like 10 gun deaths a year in the country because, you know, the amount of violence that there is in popular culture does not necessarily mean. But then again, Japan is a totally different place. There's no history of slavery or anything like that in that particular context. So there you have lots of, you know, violence in literature, but no violence on the street. So I'm kind of guessing that dichotomy isn't there. So in that regard, it is, you know, in answer to the question that's posed by that, is it reflector or director? No, it's not. It exists. It exists separately. Or America's a fundamentally violent, racist society, and this is kind of just what happens. And just because the music reflects that, doesn't mean it's directing it.
And followed by Comrade at the back.
Yeah, I want to reference what Brian said about Kamasi Washington is getting unprecedented publicity, really, for a jazz album. There's one track in particular called Fists of Fury, which directly is the soundtrack, you could say, to Black Lives Matter. And there's basically, it's a long, long instrumental track, and there's about 2 minutes of spoken word, and the last word a woman spoken word artist says is, "We will seek our retribution." And it's very interesting that this album is getting brilliant reviews in Metro. So I think a lot is happening musically, and I just think it's really important to look back. Well, you mentioned Janelle Monáe and you mentioned Prince, but I would say these are Afrofuturist artists, and it's interesting to look at an artist like Sun Ra from the 1950s, because if you're going to talk about conscious music having representation, then you have to talk about a lot of things happening musically. You have to talk about people who have the musical skill, which takes a long time to acquire. You have to talk about who can design record covers, who can negotiate deals, who can work out production, who can do mastering. Now, even if you can do technology on a basic level, to get to a level where it needs radio play, you need quite sophisticated mastering. This can be acquired at music colleges, but we know because of the cuts that colleges are much more expensive for people to get to. And I'm attached to Goldsmiths, and the music course, there's not that many black people on the course. But what is interesting is how important the teachers view artists like Sun Ra. Because on the corner of Goldsmiths College, there's actually an image of Sun Ra. And Sun Ra was a black musician from the 50s, and he basically was enormously important to jazz, spoke about Afrofuturism, developed all sorts of technology, prototype house music, prototype all sorts of things. But he spoke about how he felt as a black person. He felt so dehumanized, he felt like an alien. So he actually speaks a lot about going to a different planet. He believed he was from a different planet. And he was called up into the draft, to the war. And he was so upset about that he started cutting himself. And he got off that, and he formed a little community in Chicago. And they made albums, and they made music, and they kind of were like monks, really. Just practiced music all the time, didn't really drink, didn't have sex. I'm sure it's not a lifestyle a lot of people would want. But that's what they were so dedicated. That's what they did. They made albums. They made all their album covers. They drew all their album covers. And when you remember all this music happening now, you must remember him and his people kind of in the background, silently pushing forward, because they've always been there, and there was evidence of them in Janelle Monáe. There's evidence of them in some of the most progressive music happening, and I just think people should just go back and look at that. And I think Afrofuturism, I wanted you to comment about it, but something's really happening because of the Black Panthers and all sorts of Afrofuturist. It's a kind of socialism, but it's not. But talk about it.
I just had a quick question, really. I'm sitting at the back, I'm here to learn, and I'm mapping up the recommendations that you're making and the artists that you're mentioning. And I just wondered, I can't help noticing how male-dominated the music industry still is, and how much of how many music videos, part of the sort of backwardness that you talk about in a lot of, existing music culture is the sexism or a lot of imagery of women's bodies in music videos. So I wondered if you could have any recommendations for us of women artists who are presenting the kind of challenges that we're interested in discussing here. Perhaps even, the black lesbian artist who might one day help to lead a revolution.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning, I'm never very good at summing up, but I'll do my best. Okay, where should we start? Childish Gambino, yeah, we could have had a whole meeting just deconstructing that video. And it's true that that there are some interesting discussions going on online about it. The most fascinating thing for me is that it has been so enthusiastically received. There's such an excitement. Well, it's just so huge, the numbers who have viewed this video and who are talking about this video. It's a significant moment, in popular culture, and I think there's opportunities. As a result, I think Donald Glover is likely to not know where to take it next. You can't expect him to have all of the answers. What will be key in terms of what happens next, as I think the comrade said, is what political activists, what the left can do in the US, and there's some important discussions, and perhaps some of those discussions have been taking place at Marxism, but I think the American left is not in great shape, but there are signs of significant alliances between the Black Lives Matter movement, the best of the left in terms of in terms of people like the new senator, the newly elected Latina woman in the Bronx. Somebody help me with the name. In Queens, rather. So there are good people who are nominally in the Bernie Sanders kind of left of the Democrat camp, who have real relationships with extra-parliamentary movements and the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. So, that's going to be key. All right, there's that. Now, in terms of, and obviously I concur, in terms of the importance of Kendrick Lamar's All Right, Kamasi Washington. I suppose the closest simple answer to the question about the black lesbian who will, move us forward has to be Janelle Monáe at the moment, who's performing at the Roundhouse in September. Sold out, but I've got a couple of tickets. Okay. Sun Ra, yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. In fact, Afrofuturism is such a big and fascinating subject. Why not do a meeting about it next year yourself, really? There's lots of it. Yeah. And there's a nice little link, for those who don't know, between Afrofuturism and the love of Sun Ra and Jerry Dammers, the key person behind the two-tone movement and the person who wrote Free Nelson Mandela. And that is that he set up a whole orchestra as a tribute to Sun Ra called the Spatial AKA Orchestra. And they all dress up, as does Monet and her dancers. When they haven't got the vulva trousers on, they've often got kind of headgear a bit like Sun Ra wore, which I think is a reference to the goddess Hathor, ancient Egyptian goddess. But you're right, he was from Saturn, wasn't he? Sun Ra. So yeah, fascinating stuff there. And I agree, I think musical skill is kind of the least important in a way. I mean, there are some highly skilled musicians like Sun Ra, John Coltrane and Kamasi Washington and others, and it's wonderful to hear their music, but obviously the more important bit, I agree with you, is access to the kind of technology that you need to make music. And if I know that Lloyd Bradley spoke at Marxism a couple of years ago. I mean, what comes through in his book about history of black music in London, 100 years of black music in London, is the importance of people like Eddie Grant, who set up the first pressing plants, the first black-owned pressing plants. So, you know, we have to always go back to the material basis of these sorts of things. I mean, I know that the music's immaterial now in the sense it's all MP3s, but you know, access to these sorts of things is very much part of the story. Okay, where are we going? So yeah, I mentioned Janelle Monáe, I mentioned that. Okay, so let's talk about drill music. I'm really pleased that Brian said what he did, because I have looked into drill music a bit, and gun and knife crime has affected close friends of mine, my next door neighbours, and it's important to state, you know, the blindingly obvious, I hope, which is that I'm against music which advocates killing young black men, even if it's made by other young black men, you know. And so I think what we have to do is oppose state bans on this music, but have a conversation with the people who are making it and try to reach them in some way. I think that's the way to approach that one. So thanks for Brian's contribution. Now I'm sort of working backwards. The question about Tupac and Ice Cube and NWA. Look, it's important to acknowledge that that reality rap, as it's sometimes called, is not the same as, I mean, you know, and there's grey areas, but you know, there's sort of, I suppose, manufactured gangster rap which fabricates lurid tales of the ghetto. But then there are horrible things going on in the ghetto which are talked about, and that's completely legitimate. It's important, in fact. It's important that the concerns of some of the most marginalised people in society are placed on the table of popular culture. I think it becomes a problem when the kind of white, double-barreled named people that were referred to, and it's true, I mean, I get Music Week every week, which is the music industry paper, and it's amazing, just, you know, week after week it's these white faces. I mean, one of the most important people in the music industry at the moment actually used to sell the Socialist Worker in South London, so that was interesting. I think he's probably moved away from the politics somewhat. And there are other good people. I mean, Paul Samuels at Atlantic has been very good in terms of Love Music, Hate Racism. An old friend of mine as well, Ray Cosbert, I think he's a good guy. He's a good friend of mine, and he's actually the man who was, in my opinion, the manager who was, in my opinion, unfairly vilified in the film about Amy. He was also Amy Winehouse's manager for a while. Okay, so reality rap. So you know, and I think that the music that talks about the unvarnished reality and the challenges faced by ordinary people is very important. You know, so therefore a lot of grime music would fall into that category. The music for Kate Tempest, in a more tongue-in-cheek way, the music of the Sleaford Mods, and so on. There's lots of examples. So working my way back now to the first question about music as distraction. I think this is a big discussion. Obviously, it's not obvious. Sorry, but there was, and I mentioned this briefly in the second chapter of my book, there was an influential German musicologist called Theodor Adorno, who thought that all pop music was a weapon of mass distraction, that there was, you know, that it was absolutely on the side of the ruling classes. And his definition of pop music was pretty broad. I mean, it included all jazz and everything. I think it's a position that most of us would take issue with. What I believe is that music is politically contested, and that contest is played out in several different arenas. So somebody mentioned the disposable heroes of hypocrisy, television, the drug of a nation, breeding ignorance and feeding radiation. Well, you know, unambiguously condemning of TV and the role that it played at the time in American society. Well, here's the thing, that the hook from that song, I think I told this anecdote last year, so apologies for those of you who have heard it, but the hook for that song was used by the BBC in a competition where you had to answer questions about what had been on TV. It was Radio 1. You had to answer questions about what had been on TV the night before in order to win a free TV license. and they used this, but yeah. So the important point here is that context is key, and even the artist doesn't, you know, necessarily have control over that. I give several examples. I give examples from. I mean, there's one example which is My Boy Lollipop, which was an interesting story around that, because when Idi Amin, the first president of Uganda, came to power, his generals went into the radio station. They were breaking all the records because you know, it was I guess they didn't like the idea of playing music, and they were issuing announcements about curfews and decrees and so on. You know, it's becoming a military state, and very scary time for those who were there. I've spoken to the journalist Yasmin Al-Brown about this, and it was her who told me this anecdote. But then they suddenly realised that actually they didn't want to go off air, and they only had so much to say. They only had so many announcements about curfews. Luckily, there was one record left that hadn't been broken, and that was My Boy Lollipop. So that was played time and time again on heavy rotation during the course of that rather frightening period. So it's about context, and here's the important thing about context. We therefore have a role to play. Ordinary music lovers, political activists, we have a role to play. We can influence the context in which music is heard. We can influence the way in which popular culture is understood, and we can do that in all sorts of ways. The key thing is to keep building the movements, to keep building the political movements that might then achieve a critical mass that pop stars want to start writing about them. So, you know, in the book I talk about the way that the Black Lives Matter movement reached a tipping point, and so even artists as huge as Beyonce felt moved to reference it. So, you know, the key thing here are the political movements. That's the key thing. That's what will give musicians confidence, and that's what will give musicians ideas in the first place. So keep doing what you're doing, comrades. Thanks for listening.